This podcast is brought to you by Odiogo.com.
Horrendous atrocities in Ethiopian prisons. Tweet by Asfa Nagash, MD. Introductory note: Dear readers, it is while I have been on vacation in a county located thousands of kilometers from my second home country, Holland, where I live as exile, that I read this horrendous account of the atrocities perpetrated on fellow Ethiopians. It was while thumbing through the pages of the Ethia Media website that I stumbled on this report that carries gory account of gruesome human rights violations taking place in Ethiopia. Words cannot convey what I felt while reading this account of the barbaric atrocities, and I could not sleep that night. After having read the report, the least which I could do was to respond to one of the pleas that is making the world community know about this atrocity of the few brave Ethiopians who, at the peril of their life and in defiance of a vindictive ethnicist regime, compiled and wrote this report. So the next morning, I decided to translate it from the original Amharic language in which this report has been written into English. I have translated this Amharic document with the hope of reaching many people, dotted across every nook and corner of the world, who are concerned with human rights. Once the big hurdle of translating the original Amharic document into English has been overcome, translating the English document into other European or even Asian languages would be a minuscule task owing to the available technology at hand. And I will shortly embark on the task of translating the English document into different European languages: French, Dutch, German, Spanish, etc., with the help of some editorial help from Ethiopian and non-Ethiopian foreign friends dotted around the world. For 4 consecutive days I stayed hooked on a computer located in an internet cafe translating this Amharic document into English, on some days working for as long as 11 hours a day. As I could not afford the luxury of working on my own computer, as I have not taken laptop with me on vacation, I was not able to go through this document thoroughly to make detailed review of minor translation errors. But I believe that my translation would do justice to the original Amharic document in lucidly bringing out to readers what the few brave Ethiopians have compiled with extraordinary dedication, dexterity, sense of patriotism, and above all, sense of humanity. Translating some of the offensive insults directed at defendants by the Tigrine ethno-nationalists into English was not an easy task, as the nuances in Amharic cannot be adequately captured in the English language. So I had to search words and expressions in English which approximate to the Amharic nuances expressed in the original Amharic document. I have translated almost all of the documents except some of the introductory pages that I deemed are redundant. All the texts put between parenthesis signs are added by me by way of explaining the matter at hand. But I have translated the document pertaining to the defendants and the concluding part in its entirety. All the texts put between parenthesis signs are added by me, the translator, by way of explaining the matter at hand. Let me say that I take off my hat for those brave Ethiopians who compiled and wrote this report. I salute these brave Ethiopians for the altruistic effort in immortalizing the pain of the victims of these atrocities, so that all human beings dotted around the world may do something to alleviate the pain of these forgotten Ethiopians that languish in the dungeons of the incumbent ethnocentric regime that has been ensconced in power since May 1991. I also salute the exemplary Ethiopian from Tigray, Mr. Ermias, who has been rendered physically invalid for putting his humanity before his Tigrine ethnicity. Shocking as the gruesome manner in which these Ethiopian prisoners were physically and psychologically tortured, anyone who is aware of the hatred which some of these Tigrine ethno-nationalists, the authors and perpetrators of the atrocities documented in this translated report, were brought up, hearing narratives of alleged victimization of their ancestors by Amharas, cannot fail to fathom or understand their potential capacity and readiness to perpetrate such gruesome atrocities on Amharas and members of other ethnic groups, Oromos, Girigas, Somalis, etc. In addition to this, the ethnic ideology of hate they have embraced during the last 36 years of TPLF's emergence and its pervasive influence or hold on the psyche of its followers has made them to consider anyone outside their ethnic group as a subhuman creature. Even a member of their own group, who does not subscribe to their ethnic ideology of hate, is considered as a subhuman creature. What TPLF has done to Mr. Ermias corroborates this fact. Let me say, in passing, a little bit about the effects of ethnic nationalism on the psyche of those who are afflicted by it. Ethnic nationalism has the extraordinary capacity of blinding its followers by suspending their sense of morality. It does so by suspending the conscience of its followers and dehumanizing them to the point of denying the humanity of the members of other ethnic groups or the ethnic others. Identity or ethnic politics, which is based on the ethnic identity of a particular group, demands that an individual suspends his or her conscience and he/she submits to the wish and ideals of the leader or leaders of the ethnic group or organization such as the TPLF. In short, ethnic nationalism de-individualizes the otherwise rational individual, thereby converting him into an unreflecting human being. Such a de-individualized individual or human being, be him a learned professor at the university, Nobel laureate or a lay person, fails to differentiate between what is good and what is bad. He fails to discern between what is sane and what is insane, between what is morally sound and what is immoral, etc. In sum, an ethno-nationalist or an individual who is fired by ethno-nationalism and finds him herself under the spell of its mesmerizing, if crippling, influence loses his human attribute, that is rational thinking that sets him apart from animals. He stops to think and act as a rational human being, as he has already sacrificed his whole being on the altars of the ethno-nationalist ideology he/she has enthusiastically embraced. The German people under the Nazis were fired and mesmerized by the virulent German nationalist ideology which defined the Jews, Slav, Gypsies, etc. as Untermensch, the German equivalent of the word subhuman in English, and subsequently condemned millions of Jews, Slav, Poles, Gypsies, etc. to the gallows and gas chambers. Places like Auschwitz, in what is today Poland, and Dachau, located in the Bavaria region of Germany, bear witness to the barbarity and inhumanity of German fascism. I had the chance of visiting the museum at Dachau and witnessed the horror it embodies and immortalizes when I visited this place in October 2008. The gruesome images etched on my mind as a result of that visit would remain with me forever. By creating such museums which immortalize the worst aspect of humanity, the Germans have at least teaching their youth to distance itself from ethnic or racially based nationalist ideology which breeds hate. The Tigrine ethno-nationalists in Ethiopia have, on the other hand, built many monuments and one great museum in their capital city Mekelle to teach the Tigrine youth hatred by propagating narratives of the alleged victimization of Tigrines by Amharas. So in the hands of Tigrine ethno-nationalists, even the recent history of Ethiopia under the Derg has become a grist to the TPLF propaganda mill of hate that creates walls among the peoples of one country by fragmenting their common history of suffering, denying their common pain and the common adversity they all faced in those 17 cruel years of the Derg. Under the Derg, all Ethiopians save for those allied with the Derg suffered irrespective of their ethnic, religious or political affiliations. But during the last 36 years, the TPLF leaders acted by denying this common pain of the Ethiopian people by creating a separate Tigrine identity out of this suffering, thereby using this suffering which allegedly was solely suffered by Tigrines as a Chinese wall that separates Tigrines from non-Tigrines. It is this exclusive attitude, born out of this virulent ethnic nationalism, that forms the political backdrop to and informs the report we present hereafter. I will take up the issue of Tigrine ethnic nationalism shortly and hope to share with readers my perspective on the whole issue of ethnic nationalism that is threatening the very coexistence of the Ethiopian and the continuation of this country in its present shape. On behalf of the original authors of this report, I ask all those who read this document to bring this translated document to the attention of human rights groups and government officials and the public in your countries of residence so that the plight of these Ethiopian victims can be highlighted and eventually some action may be taken to curb these terrifying human rights violations. Here follows the translation of the chillingly gruesome account of what transpired in the Central Investigation Office CIO, otherwise known as the Maekelawi prison in Ethiopia. Asfa Nagash, MD. The translator of this document is an Ethiopian exile who lives in Holland where he works as a psychiatrist. He can be reached at debeso@gmail.com for any comment that you may have in regard to this translated report, the introductory note and the explanatory text accompanying this translated document. Horrendous account of ethnically directed atrocities in an Ethiopian prison. The CIO translated from the original Amharic document into English by Asfa Nagash, MD, resident of Amsterdam, the Netherlands, 25th of December 2010. Email address, Ginbot7@gmail.com. About the authors of this report. The authors of this report are individuals who work within the TPLF-controlled prison administration and criminal investigation system. Through what we have compiled in this report, we want to inform the Ethiopian and by extension the international community about the suffering, gruesome tortures and horrendous mistreatment of political prisoners across the country. We want to bring to the attention of readers of this report the hellish condition obtaining in what is known as the Central Investigation Office (CIO) located in Addis Ababa. According to the individuals who prepared this horrifying report at the peril of their lives, what is reported here has bearing only on the officially known major federal prisons under the incumbent government. This report has no bearing on what unfolds in those secret prisons that are dotted in the capital city Addis Ababa and the various regions of Ethiopia and are controlled by the TPLF security officials. This report has no bearing on the thousands of prisons dotted in all regions, zones and districts of Ethiopia and run by the regional overlords. Today the number of prisoners held in the various TPLF-controlled prisons is at least 50 times the number of prisoners that were held by the Derg regime at the height of the 1977 to 1978 period when serious human rights violations were committed. All this is taking place at a time when, unlike during the Derg period, there are no strong opposition groups waging anti-government struggle in the urban and rural areas. This disturbing reality heightens our worry. There is no way we can know, even if we had wished to do so, about all those legally, we mean according to TPLF's definition of legality, and illegally held prisoners whose numbers run in the tens of thousands. This is so because we do not have the wherewithal or the means to collect such evidence. The report which follows hereafter is based on what we have seen with our own eyes and what we have heard with our own ears. The goal of this report: we are not sending this report to your compatriots with the intent of making you hysterically cry about it in horror for a few days and then forget about it altogether. We have closed our doors and cried silently, hiding ourselves behind the dark. We ask you to cry as we did. But let your cry be in public, although we leave the choice of crying in silence unto you. Cry profusely or intently, saying, "O my people! O my country!" We want you to feel the pain of your compatriots and cry for these compatriots who have fallen into the hands of the TPLF regime and are suffering in its dungeons, prisons. But we do not want you to cry and then lapse into silence or omniscience. Especially those Ethiopians in the diaspora should let the world community know United Nations Human Rights Commission, World Red Cross Organization, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Genocide Watch, International Court of Justice based in The Hague, the American State Department, the Human Rights Commission of the European Parliament, and all other human rights organizations and all those who struggle to bring to justice violators of human rights about the human rights violations that ethnically target Ethiopian citizens and are carried out by the ethnically organized, ethnicist TPLF regime in the prisons of Ethiopia. You may question the very wisdom of appealing to these international bodies and ask, what of it, or what is its validity? Yes, today it may not make much sense and may not have that much validity. Many of the governments and organizations know the barbarity and cruelty of the TPLF regime. Especially the Western governments know about it, although they act as if they do not know anything or feign no knowledge of all these atrocities. It is the British who have financed and trained many of the members of the present police force, including us, the authors of this report. As a debt of gratitude to the British for this training they have given to its police force, and owing to TPLF hate for anything Ethiopian, the TPLF regime has adopted alien British police titles, thereby discarding Ethiopian titles. Thanks to this adoption of British police titles, today we and our people have been forced to use British police titles such as police constable, sergeant, inspectors, commissioner, superintendent, etc., which we can hardly pronounce. About what is dubbed crime, this report concentrates on what happened on those individuals who were imprisoned by the TPLF regime in connection with the charges leveled against General Tefera Mamo. It deals with the shockingly horrendous suffering in this hellish place known as the Central Investigation Office. We would also say something about this prison and the suffering that takes place in it. There is a lot more we would let you know in the future about the hidden face of the TPLF regime should we remain alive and should the TPLF fail to lay its powerful hands on us. You may say that the task we have embarked upon is very dangerous. You may also say that the task of uncovering or exposing TPLF atrocities on which we have embarked is a dangerous venture. Yes, we realize that too. But since we believe that death is preferable to a life of humiliation, we have chosen to pay any sacrifice. And we trust that your compatriots would not disregard our effort and sacrifice. The preparations to apprehend or capture the defendants accused in connection with the Ginbot7 political movement started 2 days before April 24, 2009, the date on which most of the defendants were imprisoned. Our Tigrine colleagues, the members of the chosen ethnic group, whose loyalty to the incumbent government is measured by their Tigrine ethnic affiliation or identity, were already informed about the planned or impending imprisonment of these defendants. But those employees like us, who do not have Tigrine ethnic identity, knew nothing about TPLF's plans that were afoot and were kept in the dark. However, on April 22, 2009 and April 23, 2009, when the group known as the Security Service and Federal Police Joint Anti-Terror Group that is staffed by Tigrines was engaged in conducting uninterrupted gathering and its members were constantly moving back and forth. They made movements characterized by unusual haste, made many telephone calls and whispered in each other's ears. All these unusual movements hinted to us, the non-Tigrine employees of the CIO, that there was something very important which this group did not want us, the non-Tigrine employees who are considered as second-class citizens, to hear about. What we had surmised or suspected came out true later. It was on April 24, 2009 in the afternoon hours that the capture of the defendants allegedly connected with the Ginbot7 political movement began, after these members of the chosen Tigrine ethnic group, who have deliberated on to draft their abduction plan behind closed doors and without consulting the non-Tigrine employees of the CIO, finalized their plan and carried out the abduction of the defendants by enlisting the help of soldiers, officers of the security force, the federal and regional police. Those who were involved in the abduction were Tigrines and some other soldiers from other ethnic groups that are considered loyal to them. All those non-Tigrines who were involved in the abduction and imprisonment of these defendants were only told about a mission they will carry out, but were not informed beforehand about what the purpose of this mission was all about. But on the other hand, even the lowest-ranking Tigrine policeman was informed about the mission beforehand. Those of us who are non-Tigrine employees of the Federal Police Force and Security Force know all too well that watching our movements was one of the tasks given to our Tigrine colleagues. And this is the standard practice in TPLF's Ethiopia. It was on April 25, 2009 that even those of us, the non-Tigrine employees of the Federal Police, Security Force involved in the abduction of these defendants, learned or realized what the mission of this action was after listening to, like the ordinary Ethiopian public, the communique of the Joint Anti-Terror Unit of the Security Service and the Federal Police that was broadcast on radio and television. We realized that this mission targeted Amharas who have been embittered by the ethnicist policy of this regime. It has been particularly directed against those Amharas who are opposed to the effort of the TPLF regime, which, owing to its vengeful attitude and hatred towards the Amharas, is bent upon breaking the back of Amharas economically, politically, thereby humiliating them in a manner that is akin to the rape of a woman. It was with the goal of imprisoning Amhara individuals with known record of opposition to this onslaught of TPLF against the Amharas, that the abduction of most of the defendants mentioned in this report was launched. In our belief and based on the alleged evidence that the TPLF regime claimed to have gathered, the majority of those defendants who were abducted from different places are individuals who are opposed to the ethnicist system of government, based on the supremacy of one ethnic group, that has been set up by the incumbent government. The recorded videotapes of individuals such as General Tefera Mamo who have openly spoken against the ethnicist nature of the present regime in a meeting where hundreds of EPDM members were gathered are available at the CIO. Some of the defendants have told the court, saying that they have already warned and told the EPDM officials, EPDM being the surrogate group which serves TPLF in the Amhara region, about the concern these defendants have regarding the suffering to which the Amhara people are exposed, the unbridled ethnocentrism and supremacist policy of the incumbent regime, and the adverse effect of this policy on the country and its people. Having heard all this at the court as was being told by the defendants, We were also able to learn from what was widely circulating in the premise of the CIO that the senior officials of the EPDM, who are believed to have sold to the TPLF not only their flesh but also their soul, have been instrumental in pressurizing the TPLF leaders to particularly imprison these Amhara officers that have now appeared in court as defendants. It is on account of the foregoing fact we cannot believe that the imprisonment of these Amhara officers is related to the Ginbot7 political movement. Although Ginbot7 political movement is a multi-ethnic group, all those imprisoned in connection with this organization, with the exception of the one relative of Dr. Burhanu, are all Amharas. As such, owing to this fact there is nothing that justifies the imprisonment of these Amhara officers in connection with Ginbot7 except TPLF's need to label Ginbot7 as a terrorist organization. From all this what we understand or distill out is that the TPLF regime singled out and imprisoned Amharas whom it suspected of mobilizing other Amharas dotted in the army, the federal police force and in society at large. The identity of those imprisoned defendants corroborates nothing other than this fact. TPLF is adept at undertaking such measures. This is the same method it has used in the past by imprisoning tens of thousands of Oromo intellectuals, army and police members opposed to TPLF by criminalizing them in the name of OLF. Mr. Hassan, an Ethiopian Somali from the Gaber ethnic Somali, he was abducted at gunpoint and is now in prison for more than 2 years, and he has not appeared in court during all these years. For 6 months his legs and feet were shackled in chains and he has repeatedly been exposed to electrocution, administration of electric current into his body by way of torture, which is now routinely carried out in TPLF-controlled prisons. His left testicle has atrophied and disappeared altogether in consequence of the severe and repeated torture he sustained. In short, he has been castrated like a bull in the Ethiopian cultural context. A bull is castrated not by taking his testicles but by pounding on his testicles. It is in this context the word castration should be read in this report. Castrating a male person like a bull or animal is unheard of and did not take place even during the terrible days of the Derg regime. Under the TPLF regime, this method of torture is widely practiced. After the May 2005 elections, many found it unbelievable when stories relating to the castration of male Amhara men who strongly supported the CUD Coalition for Unity and Democracy were heard. It was reported that TPLF cadres forced male Amharas to take off their clothes and castrated them by beating on their testicles. But for individuals like us who work in TPLF-run prisons and closely watch it and hear about the things happening in these prisons, the occurrence of these gruesome things is not surprising as we see them happen daily here in the Central Investigation Office CIO where we work. The number of citizens and their family members who have become victims of such atrocities is difficult to enumerate here. The torture to which Mr. Hassan from the Ogaden region of southeastern Ethiopia has been exposed, makes one wonder whether or not those TPLF cadres who perpetrate untold suffering on this pitiful person consider him like an experimental guinea pig locked and held in a laboratory box for the purpose of experimenting new medicinal drugs. It is not only Mr. Hassan who is treated as an experimental guinea pig by the ethnicist Tigrayan officials that form part of the TPLF. We are saddened enormously when we think about the fate and suffering of 12 Oromo youth from Nikand, Ambo, Eastern Hararg and Kimis, who like Mr. Hassan were abducted and brought to the Central Investigation Office CIO prison where they are made to suffer immensely. The hands of these Oromo youths have been tied to the wall and they have been hanged upside down and beaten with electric wires. 3 of these 12 Oromo youth have not been able to control their urine, a medical condition clinically known as urinary incontinence, in consequence of the torture and severe beating they have been subjected to. Some of these young Oromos prisoners have been rendered castrated in consequence of the torture they underwent. Some of these young Oromos have been rendered invalid, some have lost their sight or vision, the nails of some have been pulled out and the hands of some of these young Oromos have been broken in consequence of the torture to which they have been exposed. What is more, 2 of these 12 youths were abducted on the day of their wedding. Among these Oromo youth are 2 young people who are underage, both are under 15 years of age. They have been made to stay in dark rooms for a long time after their hands and feet have been shackled with chains. Among the 3 individuals who were accused of having made an attempt on the life of the Egyptian president in 1995, 1 had died in prison, whereas the other 2 have been languishing in prison for the last 15 years without appearing at court during all this time. The defendants, who have been abducted from all parts of the country and were in prison in connection with the Ginbot7 movement, had been huddled together in a prison where members of the Tigrayan ethnic group belonging to the ethnicist organization known as TPLF exclusively control everything and perpetrate horrendous crime on these prisoners. They perpetrated these crimes with a sense of impunity. As to your question regarding the fate which awaits these prisoners, we hereby present the report we have compiled as is germane or pertaining to the case of some of the prisoners under custody. For the sake of avoiding repetition, we first present what has happened to all prisoners. Atrocities perpetrated on individuals accused in connection with Ginbot7. As we stated earlier, many of the imprisoned were captured on April 24, 2009. The number of the imprisoned was far more than the 37 defendants that appeared at court. The likes of Colonel Yehiwas was co-opted and Gebiah Iqilham under the pain of torture testified against their colleagues and were accordingly released on April 24, 2009. In addition to those who were imprisoned on April 24, 2009, the TPLF regime imprisoned military officers and police members of Amhara ethnic extraction it suspected of harboring grievance towards it on the basis of the alleged information it secured from those who agreed to testify against these individuals. The arrest of these suspected Amharas continued well into the beginning of May 2009. For example, the military officers brought to Addis Ababa from Harar city, such as the 13th defendant Major Mesker Kassa, the 6th defendant Lieutenant Colonel Abair, the 7th defendant Lieutenant Colonel Alamujetnet, were captured on April 29, 2009. Few individuals have been captured around the beginning of May 2009 when they were brought to the CIO. All the defendants were dragged, blindfolded and handcuffed, into the prison cells prepared for them. Some of the prisoners were huddled together in one prison cell, whereas those suspected by the TPLF of harboring a lot of hatred for the regime were exposed to solitary confinement and made to stay in a very narrow room. We have chosen not to mention the deploring food and sleeping condition obtaining in the prison, as it pales in significance when compared to the much worse suffering these prisoners underwent under torture. We would soon expound on the torture these prisoners underwent. It is important to mention though that there were prisoners who were not allowed any food or drink and were forced to sleep rough on extremely cold cemented floor with nothing else than the clothes they wear during the day. All these prisoners were transported blindfolded and handcuffed to the nearby court located close to the Arata Georges church a few days after their arrival at prison. They were transported to the court in a canvas-covered van that makes them invisible to sight of anyone. They were later returned to the prison. The court allows the police extra days and weeks. This legal sanction by the judge allows the police investigators to do whatever they like by way of extracting forced confession from the prisoners. It should be noted that the major police investigations accompanying the tortures were conducted during the time or period in which the police was allowed extra time by the judge to complete its investigation. It should also be noted that the Anti-Terror Office of the government could not produce any shred of evidence to support its empty charges by way of providing any substantive proof that can convince any one independently functioning court of justice. Even those weapons which were displayed on television as evidence to support the allegation against General Tefera Mama were weapons which he legally possessed and were given to him by the regime before the Tefera was suspected of anti-government activities. The other weapons were, likewise, in legal possession of the present civilian defendants who were licensed to possess these weapons by the incumbent TPLF government after they applied for legal possession of these weapons 16 years ago. The Colt 38 pistol and Kalashnikov gun captured from the home of the elderly prisoner Mr. Tsajhabtamariam and subsequently presented to the court as being weapons that were to be used for criminal purposes, were weapons he purchased from a Tigreen named Mr. Jibra Medin at the cost of 4,800 birr on the eve of Derg's fall. He also possessed these weapons as legally registered property. Further, no recorded evidence of the alleged 50 telephone exchanges between General Tefera and General Assam or the alleged telephone calls made by General Tefera to Colonel Deems were presented to the court by the TPLF regime. The evidences which were presented as evidence to implicate the accused of an alleged anti-government activity on behalf of the Ginbot7 political movement were the publications, political program and communiques of this group, which can easily be accessed from internet sites and other media outlets. The government claimed that it has captured 2 satellite telephones and satellite internet communication equipment that allegedly were to be used by the plotters of the coup d'état. It is ridiculous for the government to present these as evidences to support its claims. For those of us who know the capacity of the regime to produce false evidences against its opponents, it is not unthinkable to assume that it planted these equipments in the houses of the defendants through its loyal cadres after the imprisonment of the defendants. As the government was not able to produce any incriminating evidence to justify the imprisonment of these suspected individuals, it rather resorted to beatings by way of forcing a self-confession or a denouncement of fellow prisoners as conspirators bent upon the seizure of power by bringing down a legally elected government by force of arms, that is, through unconstitutional methods. In their attempt to extract confession, the TPLF investigators tried to single out those easy targets whom they thought they could easily persuade to make self-confessions and denounce their fellow prisoners, that is, prisoners that would not budge to threats of torture. So it is against those defendants who did not budge to their threats that the investigators turned their attention. So each prisoner was dragged into the investigation torture room blindfolded, handcuffed, and was made to stand in front of investigators whom he could not see, and remained under investigation from 8 p.m. in the evening till 12 p.m. for 4 hours. There in the investigation room, the alleged crimes committed by each prisoner were read out to him/her, and the prisoner was told by the investigators that they have already gathered enough evidence against him/her, and that it was better for him/her to confess his/her crime before she is subjected to suffering torture. None of the defendants or prisoners that later appeared in court budged to the persuasion and verbal threats of the investigators and admitted having committed crime. It was at this stage that the investigators resorted to brute force or torture, at which they are so adept. Thus began the exposure of these defendants to psychological and physical torture, beatings after being hanged upside down during all the 45 days in which they stayed at the Central Investigation Office (CIO). By way of sampling the cases of some defendants, we hereafter present an account of the torture to which some of the imprisoned have been subjected. 16th Defendant Lieutenant Ababu Teferi, ethnic Amhara. He was abducted from Bahir Dar town along with 16 other men. The torture of this man and 10 other men who were imprisoned along with him began at a military camp in Bahir Dar town long before they reached the Central Investigation Office located in the capital city Addis Ababa. The faces of these prisoners were bruised, swollen, and their eyes were bleeding. As they were not able to walk properly, they were limping. Lieutenant Ababu was tortured blindfolded and handcuffed after he was hanged upside down and exposed to falanga. Falanga in English, or weeflala in the Ethiopian language, refers to the type of torture whereby the inner feet of a prisoner are beaten after he has been hanged down upside down. He was forced to take off his clothes and lie down on the floor naked after his mouth was gagged with a stinking piece of cloth by way of preventing his scream and cry reach the ears of others. For days on end, he was beaten on his head, his hands, fingers, his legs, thighs and waist area with sticks and electric wires. In addition to this, he was kicked by the investigators. The ears of this blindfolded prisoner, who was put on a chair by his torturers and exposed to repeated bouts of blows on his ears by the torturers who took turns to beat him, has left him with a severe injury to his ears, such that one of his ears remains injured to this day. On the days when there was no Amhara investigator among them, the Tigrayan investigators at the Central Investigation Office, they subjected this prisoner to degrading and humiliating insults directed at his ethnic group. He belongs to the Amhara ethnic group. Among the avalanche of insults and degrading ethnic slurs directed at him figure the following: rotten Amhara, smelly Amhara. Don't you know that the Amhara is coward? Even if we were to roast you here, do you think that the smell and consequence thereof can ever reach the Amhara people? A person who has fallen into our hands and a person who is infected with the HIV virus are the same. Do you want us to inject you with blood infected with the HIV virus? We can kill you here. We can dump your corpse anywhere and without anybody being able to challenge us to give an account thereof. These were the kind of dehumanizing insults and degrading remarks, ethnic slurs, which were hurled at this prisoner by way of mounting a psychological warfare against him. This prisoner was finally forced to sign the alleged self-confession they wanted him to undersign. And these torturers were happy and overjoyed for having broken down the spirit of this officer. 30th Defendant Vice Sergeant Gobina Bella Ethnic Amhara. This defendant has experienced similar torture as the one Lieutenant Ababu has undergone. He was taken out of his prison cell during the night and has been beaten up like a snake with electric wires. He was further electrocuted. Passage of electrical current through the body of the prisoner as a form of torture. After forcing him to take off his clothes including his underwear, and made to stand naked, he was beaten up so much that his skin has peeled off. They have derided him by making fun of the locality of his birth known as Gaunt and hurling such demeaning, humiliating and insulting words which not only insulted him but also insulted his locality, his local identity and his ethnic group. He belongs to the Amhara ethnic group. 1 Satan or devil is better than 50 Gaintes. Gluttonous Gaint refers to his local identity who comes from a locality in northwestern Ethiopia that is known as Gaunt. All this was done to force him confess what the investigators wanted him to confess under duress. This litter was finally broken by the severely incessant beatings and tortures to which he was exposed for many nights in a row. All this suffering was imposed him to force him in making self-confessions about the alleged crime he was accused of and to force him in criminalizing other prisoners. He was forced, under the pain of torture, to sign an alleged self-confession, which was already written down by the investigators themselves. It was on the basis of this self-confession, extracted from him under torture, that he and the other prisoners were convicted to sentences of lifetime imprisonment. 10 investigators were involved in the investigation of Vice Sergeant Gobina and the other prisoners. Among these 10 investigators, there are some who are known for their extreme cruelty. There is also a judge who, in spite of having seen the physical injuries suffered by these prisoners as a result of the torture they were exposed to, still chose to conspire with these investigators in ascertaining that these prisoners were not forced to make self-confessions under duress. The names of these 10 investigators and the notorious judge who conspired with them and worked hand in glove with them would be mentioned at the end of this report. 12th Defendant Colonel Fantayan Mohaba Mufti Ethnic Amhara. This prisoner was abducted on April 23, 2009 from the Western Military Command camp based in a place located in the Shire region of Tigray in northern Ethiopia. At the time of his abduction, he was conducting his job and was called by the Tigrayan Colonel Desalegn, otherwise known Kibrit, to the administration office or bureau. After he voluntarily presented himself at the office, he was given a hands-up order. On April 29, 2009 he arrived at the Central Investigation Office in Addis Ababa, to which he was brought. On his arrival at this office, unlike other prisoners, no visible physical signs of injury were noticeable on his face. The only things noticeable on his face were his exhaustion in consequence of the long journey he undertook and the anxiety which his face betrayed or radiated. The torture and beating of this defendant began after he appeared at the court located at the Arata Georges area and denied the false charges leveled against him on May 1, 2009. On this date and night around 10 p.m. local time, he was dragged to the investigation room like a sheep after he has been blindfolded and handcuffed. On this date, many more investigators, 5 investigators in all, were assigned for the task of investigating this officer who is considered by the investigators as being an arrogant person. The investigators have been instructed to reduce this arrogant officer to as small as human size by beating the hell out of him. Beating being the only language, which according to the investigators, this arrogant defendant properly understands. This instruction was given by Tais Messeret, the head of the investigation at the Central Investigation Office CIO. Tais Messeret is a notoriously cruel and ethnicist Tigrayan official. During the many nights he stayed in this prison and when most of the prisoners were sleeping, Colonel Fantayan has been exposed to tortures which no human being on this earth can withstand. As the injuries sustained by this defendant were so severe, he was being repeatedly exposed to torture after intermittently giving him treatment in the prison. Finally he signed, like all the other prisoners who were exposed to severe torture in this prison, albeit under duress, the statement which his investigators wanted him to undersign. After signing the alleged self-confession, his physical torture stopped. 22nd Defendant Mrs. Emayesh Alamu ethnic Amhara. As if the investigators assigned at the Central Investigation Office CIO have no mother or sister, what happened to this mother of 3 children and grandmother of 1 child, is extremely horrendous or gruesome. As with other prisoners, the Mrs. Emayesh has been exposed to torture and suffering during the night hours. As was the case with the other prisoners, she was led to the torture room blindfolded and handcuffed. She was hanged upside down and exposed to falanga beating of her inner feet. Her legs, hands, thighs and buttock were subjected to a grueling torture and beating in such a cruel manner that defy any explanation or cannot be adequately conveyed in words. The investigators were interrogating her by asking if she knows certain individuals. They called the names of these individuals and asked her if she recognizes the said individuals by showing her the photographs of these individuals. They were accusing her of having met these individuals and told her to admit that she knew these individuals. While being beaten by the investigators, she was asked by them to witness against the individuals they named. From among all the torture to which this woman was subjected, what was strikingly gruesome was the fact that she was beaten with electric wires till her breasts were bleeding. This happened after she was forced to take off her clothes, including her underwear, and beaten naked. The pain which was caused to this woman in consequence of the beating she sustained on her breasts was such that it has not yet subsided even long after she was transferred to the Kalidi prison. And on the basis of the evidence we have gathered from the Kalidi prison, she has to use painkillers to decrease the intensity of the pain she experiences in consequence of the beating she underwent at the CIO. Mrs. Emayesh has signed, albeit under duress, the alleged self-confession which her torturers wanted her to undersign. 36th Defendant Mr. Gitu Warku ethnic Urij. What distinguishes Mr. Warku from all the other prisoners is the fact that he is not an ethnic Amhara. He is a close relative of Burhanu Niga, leader of the Ginbot7 movement, who happens to be an ethnic Urij. The CIO has no evidence to incriminate Mr. Gitu Warku. But he has been charged with others in connection with conspiracy to undertake acts of terror against the incumbent government. This prisoner has been exposed to severe torture like the other prisoners. What sets his case apart though is the following. After he fainted and fell down consequent upon severe beatings he was subjected to, he was raised up from the ground by the torturers, who subsequently handcuffed him and hanged him upside down for 19 hours on end. Yes, here you may ask, how can a person be hanged upside down for 19 hours? This is not an exaggerated or falsified statement. The investigators of Mr. Gitu, who were beating him all the night and having failed to find any evidence or admission of guilt from him, left him hanging by slamming the torture room shut. The next day during the afternoon, they opened the door and brought down Mr. Gitu from the wall they were hanging him onto. We have evidence that the blood which was dripping from the hands of this man and was left hanged upside down for 19 hours, was all over the floor of the torture or investigation room. The injury which Mr. Gitu had undergone was so severe that he was not able to go to toilet or properly use the toilet. In consequence of this, he has been forced to make use of a small metal container located in his prison cell as a toilet. Even then, he has to be supported by his prison mates, who have to support him in making use of the small metal container in the prison cell where he and all his prison mates were housed. Mr. Gitu has finally signed the alleged self-confession which his torturers wanted him to undersign. And after signing what they wanted him to undersign, the torture has stopped. 6th Defendant Lieutenant Colonel Abir Asfa ethnic Amhara. This defendant was abducted on the 29th of April 2009 in the city of Harar. He, along with 2 other officers, was brought to the CIO on May 2, 2009 at 12 a.m. All 3 officers showed no visible signs of injury or anxiety except that they were handcuffed and their clothes looked dirtier. All 3 officers were brought on Saturday, May 2, 2009 to the Arata Georges area court and were asked whether or not they admit or deny the charges leveled against them. They denied the charges leveled against them with regard to an alleged attempt of bringing down the incumbent government by force and cause violence. As usual, the police asked the court to allow it extra time to conduct and finish its investigation. This means the 3 officers would stay in custody till the time the investigators finish their investigation. the police made its request to a TPLF member by the name of Judge Tarikwa. She is someone who is notoriously known for her ignorance and loyalty to the TPLF regime. The judge gave the police the extra time the latter requested. All TPLF judges know what the police would do with the prisoners when they allow the police extra time to conduct its investigation. They know that they are giving the police more time to gather false witnesses and evidences. They know that they are allowing time to the police so that the prisoners would make self-criminalizing confessions under the pain of severe torture to which they would be subjected by the investigators. The judges are fully aware of the fact that by giving the police more time to conduct its investigation, they are actually allowing the police to subject prisoners to severe tortures. Although the judges are not involved in the torture of the prisoners by being present in the torture chambers, they are morally and legally accountable for the suffering they cause to these prisoners, knowing all too well what the investigators would do to these prisoners. After this woman judge allowed extra time to the police to conduct and complete its investigation, the investigation on Colonel Aber began the next day on the evening of May 3, 2009 at 8:30 p.m. First they started to make verbal threats against him, and later the verbal threat was followed by the usual bluff and dehumanizingly offensive insult meant to degrade and belittle his ethnic group. Aber belongs to the Amhara ethnic group. The investigators who were assigned by Tades Mazer to undertake the investigation were all ethnic Tigranes. The boundlessly rude insult and anti-Amhara verbal assault directed against Colonel Aber were uttered in full knowledge of the fact that all the investigators present were Tigranes. As such, they thought no one could overhear what they were hurling at this prisoner by way of verbal assault. As the investigators trusted each other on account of their common ethnic origin, they were confident that no one would come to know about the offensive insults they were hurling or throwing at this prisoner. What these Tigrayan investigators at the CIO did not know was the fact that amongst the torrents of insults they were vehemently and loudly uttering or blurting out, some were reaching the ears of individuals present outside the walls of the torture room. The fact that such kind of offensive insults directed against one's ethnic group were constantly hurled at prisoners by the ethnicist Tigrayan torturers has been reported at the court by General Asamitsaj, one of the Amhara generals who have been accused of being the ringleader of the alleged coup d'état against the incumbent TPLF regime. These ethnicist Tigrayan investigators and torturers were assaulting Colonel Aber with the types of degrading insults that we reproduce or present hereafter. Quote, "Is it by your type of coward Amhara that the system of government we have set up through the sacrifice of so many determined Tigrayan heroes is going to be demolished or brought down? We would make, not only you but, your whole Amhara ethnic group members and their descendants serve us as cooks in our kitchen after we have made you wear a woman's clothes." To make a man wear a woman's clothes in Ethiopian culture presupposes humiliating and condemning him to a task which is traditionally seen as the sole preserve of women. As such, this statement has a derogatory implication when viewed against the backdrop of the Ethiopian tradition. Translator's explanatory note or addendum. Unquote, by crossing the person of Colonel Aber, these Tigrayan investigators were bombarding the Amhara ethnic group with insults, the severe consequences of which they could not foresee at this moment. In the CIO, such kinds of ethnically directed offensive insults are common, and they are directed against any one prisoner who happens to be a non-Tigrayan. Although these Tigrayan investigators at CIO and their leader Prime Minister Meles Zenawi cheat people by verbally claiming that they are champions of the rights of nations and nationalities, what they harbor inside their hearts is an offensive ethnic contempt for non-Tigrayans, the smell of which can reach Adwa, the birthplace of the incumbent leader Meles Zenawi. Any one non-Tigrayan prisoner, who has fallen into their hands and has been at the CIO prison, knows the contempt that these Tigrayan investigators harbor for all non-Tigrayans dotted around all nooks and corners of Ethiopia. This is an extremely worrying and terrifying thing. After the degradingly offensive insult, the body of Colonel Aber was exposed to a barrage of beatings. He was given many blows on his face. When they told him to admit that he was organizing people to demolish the constitutional order, he responded by saying that I did not organize people to bring down the constitutional order. As I can glean or infer from what you are telling me now, I have been in prison because of the hatred you have for my ethnic group, that is, for being member of an Amhara ethnic group. The Tigrayan investigators called names of senior founders and current Central Committee members and senior officers of ANDM Amhara National Democratic Movement, a puppet political organization that has been created by TPLF to serve it as a stalking horse in the Amhara region, alleging that they were encouraging and stimulating Colonel Aber and his associates to embark on the task of bringing down the constitutionally constituted political order that is the incumbent government. Further, they were alleging that he was the only person who used to contact these ANDM officials and senior officers in order to prevent the exposure of the latter. The investigators told Colonel Aber to admit all these things. When he refused to admit what they were telling him to admit, he was subjected to grueling sessions of torture every night and during many consecutive days. In one of these nights, when he was being tortured, the nail of his large toe of his left foot was torn apart from his flesh and was left hanging. One of the Tigrayan investigators proudly uttered the following offensive words and threatened by saying that he would deflate the alleged arrogance and contempt of Colonel Aber. It is me who would drain off all the sense of pride this contemptuous Amhara and deflate him. Having said this, the Tigrayan investigator stepped with his shoes on the hanging toenail of this Amhara officer. When the Tigrayan investigator stepped on the hanging toenail of this prisoner, Colonel Aber collapsed under the pain he sustained due to this cruel and inhumane action of the investigator. After Aber collapsed, they stopped beating him. Although the next morning Aber was seen by the medical personnel of the prison, the medical personnel who saw Colonel Aber could not do anything to help him except feeling very sad about what she saw. The only thing she could say was, "What can I do? It is for me a question of survival." As a consequence of the severe beating he underwent, Colonel Aber has not been able to move about. He could only go to toilet with the support of other fellow prisoners. As he was not able to sit on the toilet alone, bricks have to be piled up to support him in sitting on the toilet. Finally, all this pain and severe beatings broke down the spirit of this officer and he agreed to sign the alleged self-confession they prepared for him. Like his other brothers and sisters in the prison, he told them that he would sign whatever they wanted him to undersign. 13th Defendant Major Mezakir Kassa, ethnic Amhara. Major Mezakir Kassa was brought from Harar along with Colonel Aber and other officers. He has gone through similar torture and beatings like the others. He was subjected to 6 hours of severe physical and psychological torture each day during 7 consecutive days after he has been blindfolded and handcuffed. The hubris and arrogance of the investigators and the kind of ethnically degrading remarks directed against him on account of his Amhara ethnic origin and the questions he was required to answer were similar to the ones Colonel Aber experienced. Finally, Major Mezakir, like all the other prisoners, acceded to the wish of his Tigrayan investigators and signed the false self-confession they prepared under the pain of torture. He had to sign the self-confession in order to halt his physical pain and suffering under torture. 31st Defendant Vice Sergeant Yabeltal Buranu, ethnic Amhara. This person, who is a member of the Federal Police Force, has gone through similar process of imprisonment and suffering. According to the classification criteria pursued by the Tigrayan investigators at the CIO, this prisoner was classified or categorized as belonging to the group of those individuals that were assigned to be the executioners of the alleged terror and attempted coup d'état. In other words, he was not classified among the group of plotters or authors of the alleged coup d'état. As such, the investigators wanted him to tell them the senior government officials whom the coup plotters wanted to be killed. Further, they wanted him to witness against those individuals whom the Tigrayan investigators consider to be the plotters that lurk behind the alleged coup d'état. The saddest thing of all is the extreme cruelty and offensive attitude the Tigrayan investigators show towards those prisoners who, in their opinion, are lower than themselves. All prisoners at the CIO have suffered a lot. But none have suffered so much as Vice Sergeant Yabeltal, the 32nd Defendant Vice Sergeant Yeshiwas Midiku, the 33rd Defendant Sergeant Wooden Temesgan, and the 28th Defendant Sergeant Amarabal Abel, all of whom have been subjected to extremely severe physical and psychological torture, non-stop and for weeks on end. The Tigrayan investigators wanted Vice Sergeant Yabeltal Buranu to witness against General Tefera Mamo and other high-ranking officers they wanted to criminalize. The best witness which the Tigrayan investigators could produce at the court was evidence in the form of a personal witness. The CIO investigators thought that by subjecting these low-ranking officers of the federal police to severe tortures, they would convince them to serve as testify against the alleged coup plotters. On the basis of the evidence we have compiled, we have not been able to establish that General Tefera Mamo has been subjected to the kind of severe torture the other prisoners have experienced. But many prisoners were severely tortured by way of forcing them to stand as witness against General Tefera Mamo. The suffering of Vice Sergeant Yabeltal Burhanu is rendered very unique because he was required to testify against General Tefera. Although he has undergone the beating and suffering all other prisoners underwent, what makes the suffering of Vice Sergeant Yabeltal Burhanu unique is what transpired on the evening of May 11, 2009 during when he was taken out of prison blindfolded and handcuffed. He thought he was being taken to the torture chamber. But he was dragged like a sheep into a car. After having been put in the car, he was taken into a forest located nearby the capital city Addis Ababa. The Tigrayan investigators clicking their automatic Kalashnikovs and pistols and directing their weapons at him told him the following. "You have been condemned to being killed and dumped in this forest. If you have anything you want to pass on to your family, say it now." He was subjected to an endless wave of psychological terror by being exposed to such threats. The investigators were discussing together and acting as if they were looking a favorable place in the forest where they could shoot and kill him. While doing this, all the time they made sure that he was hearing what they were saying to each other about what they were going to do with him. Subsequently, seeing the anxiety with which he was reeling as all this drama was unfolding, the investigators were boasting by telling each other saying that we have terrorized him to the point of making him urinate on his own clothes or piss himself. They were repeating these words and laughing even after they returned to their office within the premise of the CIO prison. In that forest this prisoner was ordered to lie down facing the ground and subsequently the Tigrayan investigators were telling each other to shoot him. The prisoner who heard the investigators talking about the impending killing, to which he would be subjected, pleaded with them or beseeched them not to kill him. Later these investigators were jokingly talking about the manner in which this prisoner has been crying and beseeching them so that they would not kill him. After forcing the prisoner to lie face down on the ground for a long time, one of the investigators would say kill him while the other investigator says this is just a poor guy, what does he know? Actually the ones who should be killed are his bosses who led him into all this mess. This was the kind of drama they were enacting when they took this poor prisoner to the forest nearby Addis Ababa where they were playing upon this poor soul, a method of investigation they were taught by their British trainers by way of extracting information from a prisoner under duress. Later the investigators were jokingly talking and laughing about what this prisoner went through in the forest when they knocked him with the butt of their guns' pistols. When he was being kicked by them and told to move forward in front of them, thereby knocking himself against a tree as he was blindfolded and could not see what was on his path. In addition to all this, they used to threaten him saying, "Who would waste a bullet to kill you? We would hang you on a tree with a rope." They looped a noose around his neck, thereby tightening and loosening the noose by way of terrorizing him psychologically and physically. Even after having been forced to suffer all these tormenting physical and psychological tortures, this prisoner could not admit to committing any of the crimes they charged him with. So they returned him to the CIO prison and they forced him to take into his mouth an electric wire, thereby electrocuting him by forcing electrical current to pass through his teeth and mouth. As a result of the electric shock, this prisoner had fallen down on the ground. Then the investigators poured water on him and asked him, "Is it enough for you or do you want more?" Thereby referring to the torture he was subjected. He said to the investigators, "It is enough, all what you say is right," and raised his hand as a token of agreeing with what they said. But the suffering of Yabeltal did not end here. The investigators had wanted Yabeltal to testify against many individuals whom they wanted to criminalize. As such, on the evening of May 14, 2009 they took him again for further investigation. By naming the names of high-ranking officials of the incumbent regime, the investigators asked him to denounce individuals who had promised to give him money after he has killed these high officials of the incumbent government. Yabeltal said he would not agree to do this and refused to comply with the wish of his Tigrayan investigators. After this, the investigators threw him into a small room, which is specifically constructed as a place of torture, and where one can neither stand nor sit down. And they left him there. That same night, the investigators came back to his prison cell and angrily threatened him with the following offensive statements. "You bloodsucker, God shame, we will burn you." Subsequently they dragged him like a sheep and subjected him to another gruesome suffering and pain. After having forced him to take off his clothes including his underwear, they did beat him. Subsequently, they filled a plastic container with water and hanged onto his penis and began to pull it, all the while mockingly jeering at him. In order to spare their ears the painful scream of this prisoner and to prevent others from hearing his cry, they gagged his mouth with smelling socks and continued to torture him severely. Finally he collapsed on the ground and turned unconscious in consequence of the torture. As usual, they poured water on his body but he did not wake up. Subsequently he was sent, along with accompanying police personnel, to the police hospital. He was later returned to his prison cell after a few days of treatment at the hospital. We were able to verify that upon return to the prison, this prisoner was condemned to stay in solitary confinement till June 6, 2009. All those investigators and employees of the CIO who have seen how Ginbot7 survived all these tortures, have now understood that a human being can endure a lot of physical and psychological suffering and that a human being does not easily succumb to death. The case of Ginbot7 has become something which is widely talked about and referred to as an example of the human endurance of suffering. 32nd Defendant Vice Sergeant Yeshiwas Midaku Ethnic Amhara Vice Sergeant Yeshiwas has been taken to the investigation room blindfolded and handcuffed. He was subjected to torture on consecutive days after he has been hanged upside down. Subsequently, he was subjected to beatings phalanga with electric wires, stick, and he has sustained severe hand blows to his ears till his ears were rendered deaf. We have been able to ascertain that he was subjected to all these tortures. 33rd Defendant Sergeant Wooten Temesgen Ethnic Amhara Sergeant Wooten Temesgen was abducted on the night of May 13, 2009. A Tigrayan officer by the name of Chief Inspector Burr was the officer that captured Sergeant Wooten Temesgen. Burr told Temesgen that he was wanted in connection with his work and took him by car to the CIO. After he reached the CIO, Temesgen was briefly seen sitting on the veranda that lies in front of an office within the CIO premise. After a few minutes, armed federal police members and few investigators returned with Burr and took away Temesgen blindfolded and handcuffed. In full daylight and in full view of the public who was hearing what the Tigrayan investigators were saying, the following offensive words were uttered against Temesgen as they led him away, thereby roughing up in due course. "You gluttonous Amhara! We were able to timely got hold of you, having learned that you were bought with money and charged with the task of shooting at the incumbent government." Then he was brought into a room where the head of CIO, the Tigrayan Tais Meseret, and other Tigrinya-speaking investigators were waiting for him. The beatings started the same day. The head of the CIO, Tais Meseret, and all those ethnicus Tigrayans who gathered at his office hurled all the degrading and humiliatingly rude insults which they could think of by way of insulting the Amhara ethnic group. Depending on what pleased them to do by way of mistreating him, some slapped him on his face, others gave him a blow with their fist, and still others kicked him. Subsequently they told this prisoner that his investigation will continue the next day and sent him to his prison cell. The next day the investigators did beat him for 2 hours on end, that is from 8 p.m. to 10 p.m., and they quenched their thirst of causing suffering to others through beating. But what happened to Wooten Temesgen on May 15, 2009 was very different from all the suffering they went through in the days prior to this day. On this day, they gagged his mouth with his own socks and subsequently took off his clothes. Afterwards, they pounded on his penis and testicles in a manner which enacted the castration of a bull, although castration involves the removal of testicles of a male animal or human. In this case, in the final analysis, the pounding on the testicles of this man rendered him infertile indefinitely. Under this suffering, he collapsed and turned unconscious and remained lying naked on the floor for a long time. The Tigrayan torturers poured water on his naked body by way of waking him up. When he was brought back to his prison cell, his hands, legs, feet and his head were swollen as a result of the severe beating he was subjected to. His head was bleeding. The severe pain he felt while trying to urinate was such that even his prison mates who felt his pain had to break into tears witnessing his searing pain and suffering. The urine which he passed out after having exerted himself with much pain was nothing but blood. Passing out urine with blood is a medical condition known clinically as hematuria. Medically speaking, three major causes to hematuria, that is a cancer or malignity affecting the urinary system, b infection, and lastly c trauma. In this particular case, as with all the other cases mentioned in this report, the hematuria has been caused by the physical trauma that is in consequence of the severe beating he was exposed to through torture and the pounding of his penis and testicles by the torturers. The names of those investigators who perpetrated this beating on this prisoner are known. 28th Defendant Chief Sergeant Amarabal Abel, an ethnic Amhara. Chief Sergeant Amarabal Abel was surrounded by some 30 uniformed soldiers led by Commander Warku and Chief Inspector Burhan April 24, 2009 at his place of work. Like all prisoners, he was rendered naked by the Tigrayan investigators and went through similar suffering the other prisoners went through at the CIO. For 14 nights on end, Chief Sergeant Amarabal Abel was subjected to severe torture. During one of these torture sessions to which he was subjected, he was insulted by one of the Tigrayan investigators in the following manner: "Dirty, a man of dirty ethnic origin." At the same time the same Tigrayan investigator, who was hurling this insult, poured hot tea on the face of this prisoner. This prisoner was accused of allegedly planning to kill 4 senior officials of the incumbent government, and he was subsequently asked to witness against those individuals whom he is presumed to know and who have allegedly instructed him to carry out the assassination of senior government officials. The purpose of the investigation was to make him admit these charges leveled against him and sign the alleged self-confession, on which the investigators have already written down these false charges. Finally he had to sign this alleged self-confession under duress in consequence of the torture he underwent. 20th Defendant Yeshwas Manjisha, an ethnic Amhara. The torture to which Yeshwas Manjisha has been subjected began on the 27th of April 2009 around 9 p.m. and continued for 3 consecutive days. The torture was accompanied by a warning to him about the notorious record of the CIO as an investigation center. The threatening warning is reproduced verbatim hereafter, quote, "There is no one here who has entered this prison and left without divulging whatever he knows. We have forced so many arrogantly defiant persons, who initially claimed they would not budge an inch, into making them lick our boots and beg for our pardon. If you refuse to talk or admit what you know, we would talk to you in the language of the illiterate, as you are illiterate. Your nails of your feet would be pulled out, we will hang you upside down with a rope, and you will be smelted with electricity." Unquote. When Yeshwas told them that he knew nothing about the charges and accusations leveled against him, they put into effect all the verbal threats they made against him and subjected him to severe torture. During 2 consecutive days, they tortured him by hanging him upside down, fixing his body onto the wall and forcing him to stand on the nails of his feet, and pouring torrents of insults directed against his Amhara ethnic group. They scolded him and scoffed at him by saying "our Bele Zelik." Translator's note: Bele Zelik was a very famous Ethiopian patriot from Gujam who won national acclaim after he scored lots of victories against Italian fascist invaders of Ethiopia during the 5-year occupation of Ethiopia between October 1935 and April 1941. They spitted on his face and tortured him for long hours till he collapsed and turned unconscious under torture. While torturing him, they continued hurling insults directed at his Amhara ethnic group. They were calling him an Amhara chauvinist who still remains with chauvinist sentiment and attitude. Finally, unable to resist the extreme torture he underwent, Yeshwas gave in to their demand and signed the alleged self-confession they wanted from him. He accepted as being true all that they wrote down and presented to him and signed it. 11th Defendant Major Adugna Alamayahu, an ethnic Amhara. Major Adugna Alamayahu was captured on April 24, 2009. His imprisonment is different from all other prisoners on 2 counts in that he was imprisoned along with his wife and his 1.5 years old child. Secondly, after he appeared at court, he denied all the torture and suffering he and his wife were subjected to in prison. In addition to this, he testified against other prisoners. He did all this hoping that he would be freed as was promised to him by the investigators. In spite of his denial of the suffering to which he and his wife were subjected, and the false testimony he gave against other prisoners, the court sentenced him to 15 years of imprisonment without parole. The inhumane suffering which this man, his wife and child had gone through till the day he agreed to testify against other prisoners, need to be documented and told here. Both he and his wife had been taken to the investigation room blindfolded and handcuffed and subsequently subjected to severe torture after their mouths had been gagged with piece of cloth. According to the prisoners who heard the cry of this child, when the wife of Major Adugna was being taken from her prison cell for torture, her 1½ years old daughter was crying in a very heartbreaking manner. The woman prisoners imprisoned with the wife of Major Adugna, unable to calm this child and unable to stop her from crying, began to sob along with this child as they were helpless to do anything by way of helping the child. Although Major Adugna Alameahu and Major Adefras Asamu had acted in a shameful manner by cooperating with the Prosecutor General of the incumbent regime in falsely testifying against other prisoners, we have here documented what has been done to Major Adugna Alameahu, his wife and daughter by way of letting the people of Ethiopia and the international community know about it. Although the TPLF regime tried to cover up what it has done to Major Adugna and his family and trick Major Adugna into cooperating with the incumbent government in return for release and subsequently reneged on the promise it made to him, we have here exposed the whole truth the TPLF regime wanted to bury about this whole case. 21st Defendant Mengistu Beebe, an ethnic Amhara. As of the 24th of June 2009, Mr. Mengistu Beebe has suffered torture for 45 days. This young engineer is among the few civilians in prison in connection with the Ginbot7 political organization. When he was thrown into prison, he was taking care of his 3-year-old child after his wife, who like him is an engineer by profession, was sent abroad in connection with the pursuit of higher education. The investigators of CIO have applied in him all types of torture methods, including phalange beating of his inner feet. In consequence of the blow or beating he sustained on his penis, he was passing out blood with his urine, a clinical condition known as hematuria and is secondary to trauma or beating in this particular case. As he was not able to stand on his own or sit down, he has to be supported by other fellow prisoners in all the movements he made. As he was not able, unlike other fellow prisoners, to sit on the toilet, bricks have to be piled up by way of giving him support in order to facilitate his use of the toilet. Although the investigators have denied any knowledge of having tortured him, at the court, Mengistu has bravely, courageously and defiantly spoken about the gruesome torture and beating to which he was subjected by the Tigrayan investigators. Although the investigators denied torturing him, he was able to ask his prison mate who shared prison cell to serve him as witness in testifying what this elderly prison mate has known about the torture to which Mengistu was exposed. The 83-year-old cellmate of Mengistu, named Mr. Tsaj Habtemariam, who happens to be the father of Andargachu Tsaj, one of the leaders of the Ginbot7 political movement, testified at the court by stating that Mengistu was severely beaten by the investigators. Mr. Tsaj was himself humiliated and made to suffer in prison. Mr. Tsaj himself has been taken to the investigation room blindfolded and handcuffed on more than 9 occasions. The investigators, who was worried that the leakage of the torture and beating to which Mengistu was subjected would lead to the publicization of the tortures of all the other prisoners, had tried to convince Mr. Tsaj not to testify in support of Mengistu. The investigators have even tried to reach a settlement or deal with Mr. Tsaj by telling him that they were ready to negotiate with him on the condition of his incarceration should he cooperate with them. But Mr. Tsaj did not budge to their effort at cheating him and putting pressure on him. He answered them by saying the following: "If I cannot tell the truth about what I have seen at this advanced age, when will I give my testimony? You can do whatever you like." Thus he gave his testimony about the beating of Mengistu Beebe by testifying in favor of the latter at the court. Mr. Tsaj is not only weak and frail on account of his advanced age. He is also someone who suffers from diabetes mellitus and a worrisome heart condition. On account of the testimony he gave at the court, he was labeled by the investigators of the TPLF regime as a cursed old man. This old man has been sentenced to lifetime imprisonment and languishes in prison now. Although Mengistu Beebe told the court that he was forced to sign a false statement written and presented to him by the investigators under duress, and in spite of the fact that the old man testified at the court that Mengistu was indeed tortured, the court judges rejected Mengistu's plea to invalidate what the investigators presented as a genuine self-confession by Mengistu. The court concluded by saying more than the testimony of Mr. Tsij, we give more weight to the statement Mengistu Habib gave by stating that he has signed the written statement without being put under any pressure. The court also added that it gives more weight to the statement of Judge Shamsu Sargaga mentioned on the statement prepared by the investigators. The court said that the alleged torture of Mengistu Habib by the investigators is a fiction fabricated by Mengistu Habib and Mr. Tsij. The attempt of Mengistu Habib to get justice was in vain. The court judge passed verdict of death and lifetime sentence by referring to Article 35 of the Ethiopian Criminal Code, thereby falsely adding that Mengistu Habib has voluntarily stated at the court he signed the written statement without pressure being put on him by the investigators. So who were these torturers and what was the role of Judge Shamsu Sargaga in this aborted judicial process that has itself become victim of an evil conspiracy? Our next focus will be on these issues. Those who give orders to torturers and the torturers. What makes the case of our country Ethiopia worrisome is the fact that those who control the reign of power and the army, the security, the federal and regional police force and do whatever they want in prison, kill, beat, etc. are members of one ethnic group, that is Tigrayans. They do anything with impunity and are not in any way accountable to the law or anyone. This ethnically based power structure is the main cause of the cruelty and suffering perpetrated against Ethiopians, including crimes which one cannot imagine would be committed against human beings in this age and in this contemporary world. Someone who is poisoned with ethnic hatred cannot see people from other ethnic groups as human beings. An ethnicist cannot see children of ethnic groups outside his own as children. Cannot see women of other ethnic groups as women. Cannot see the elderly from other ethnic groups as an elderly person. This is so on account of the fact that an ethnicist is someone who has lost the human lens that allows him/her to see all human beings as humans. The German Nazis, the Rwandan Hutus used to consider Jews and Tutsi as pests and cockroaches respectively, thereby dehumanizing and reducing them into subhuman creatures before they subjected them to genocide. The fact that the Tigrayan ethnics or ethno-nationalists harbor similar outlook about non-Tigrayans in Ethiopia has become clear from what they are doing today and from their records of the last 20 years. The only problem facing the Tigrayan ethno-nationalists who wield power today is the fact that they have not been able to materialize their ethnicist project on the scale of the Nazi Germans and Rwandan Hutus. The fact that they belong to a minority group has not allowed them to perpetrate a massive genocide on the scale of what the Nazis in Germany and the Hutu ethnicists in Rwanda have perpetrated. However, the Tigrayan ethno-nationalists have the ethnicist hatred which allows them with the potential capacity of perpetrating mass genocide on non-Tigrayans. Clues pointing to the genocidal capacity of Tigrayan ethno-nationalists have been abound, as can be gleaned from what transpired in Oromia, Gambela, Ogaden, Sidama, Hawassa, Gondar, Gujam, Addis Ababa and other parts of Ethiopia, and as witness what they did in Mogadishu, the capital city of the neighboring failed state of Somalia. These Tigrayan officials, who consider themselves to be members of the chosen ethnic group, have under them people who come from different ethnic groups, work for them and whom they order at will. As these Tigrayans control everything in their hands, including all the power, the whole wealth of the country, salaried employees who happen to be citizens of a poor country with no other means of livelihood, have to obey and enforce the order of their Tigrayan overlords. Some of these non-Tigrayans go beyond the call of duty to serve as the right hand of these ethnicist Tigrayans. This last group of non-Tigrayans who serve as right hands of the Tigrayan overlords are individuals who have no respect for the very community they hail from. Moreover, they tend to be obsequious and self-ingratiating individuals who prostrate themselves before their Tigrayan overlords. The Amhara National Democratic Movement members we mentioned earlier in this report are good examples of this latter group. The condition obtaining in the Central Investigation Office (CIO) is also the same. The officials, the holders of chief or key positions in the CIO, are all Tigrayans. Those who give orders to torture prisoners are these same Tigrayan bosses or officials. Although he is currently removed from the CIO, the official who ordered the torture and beatings of all those individuals that have been in prison in connection with the OLF Oromo Liberation Front, CUD Coalition for Democratic Unity, ONLF Ogaden Liberation Front and the Ginbot7 political movement, and the person who made the CIO a notorious center of cruelty and suffering was the Tigrayan Tais Messeret. The immediate head of Tatis's Tamarad is Getachew Asfa, the Ethiopian security chief. And the immediate head of Getachew Asfa is Meles Zenawi, the strongest man of Ethiopia. What connects all these three individuals is not the government structure of which they form a part, but the ethnicist structure, which is premised on the fact that all three hail from the same ethnic group, that is Tigrine ethnic group. The order or instruction which passes through this ethnic structure of power is communicated in the Tigrigna language, the language spoken by members of the minority Tigrine ethnic group, who represent 6% of the Ethiopian population, on whose behalf TPLF controls now state power in Ethiopia. On account of the Tigrine ethnicist ideology that permeates the CIO and issues from Tates Messeret and his two Tigrine bosses Getachew Asfa and Meles Zenawi that symbolizes ethnicist ideology, the CIO has been converted into a torture institution where non-Tigrine prisoners are insulted, dehumanized, humiliated and degraded because of their ethnic origin, in addition to the torture and beatings they undergo here. The CIO has under its control a Tigrine cabal group composed of Tigrines who have been brought together through benefits that accrue to them and are organized in such a way as to perpetrate any crime against anyone deemed enemy or opponent of the regime. This ethnicist structure is omnipresent in all regions of Ethiopia and in all structures of government, army, police and security organs. Today in Ethiopia, in addition to what is officially known as the Ethiopian government, there is another government of Tigrine ethno-nationalists composed of looters and cruel people who are not amenable to the rule of law and are not accountable to anyone. The incumbent regime is a government which is constituted by members of the Tigrine People's Liberation Front TPLF. It is not without reason that the TPLF has not changed its name even 20 years after it has assumed power in Ethiopia. The only way the TPLF can prolong its stranglehold on Ethiopia and continue to control Ethiopia is by remaining beholden to its ethnic political structure and by maintaining an organization that is composed of Tigrines who are organized on the basis of ethnicity. The exceptionally horrifying ethnically motivated torture and cruelty perpetrated at the CIO, and elsewhere in the country, is carried out by this ethnically organized Tigrines. On account of the ethnically structured nature of the system and the ethnic reinforcement this ethnic structure affords and the mutual benefit it offers to its Tigrine employees, the divulging of information pertaining to the gruesome tortures and the cruelty obtaining at the CIO and other federal police stations has been very minimal. It is only 10% of what transpires in these torture centers that gets to the ears of the Ethiopian public. Even this information could only be gathered mostly thanks to the effort of members of other ethnic groups, that is non-Tigrines, and thanks to those brave and courageous individuals who suffered in TPLF prisons as victims. And sometimes information has been leaked out by Tigrine individuals who, like any one human being, put their humanity before their ethnicity. There are also informations that are sometimes leaked out by Tigrine individuals who refuse to carry out the orders of their bosses. Here we have the duty of reporting the case of a Tigrine individual, former employee of the prison system, who was instructed to torture General Tefera Mamo but refused to carry out this order of his Tigrine bosses and was subsequently fired from his job. This brave Tigrine was later chased by a car and hit, thereby being rendered invalid. We wish we could not mention his name, knowing as we do, that the TPLF officials would cause more harm to him than they have already done. But the harm that would be caused to him by not mentioning his humane deed would outweigh the harm that would be done to him by the TPLF. We say to Ermias, the exemplary Tigrine who conscientiously refused to carry out the orders of his ethnicist Tigrine bosses, let God protect you. The greatness of the debt of gratitude the Ethiopian people and particularly the Tigrine people owe to Ermias, who refused to carry out the ethnicist orders of Tates Messeret and his ethnicist friends, can only be measured in the future. But an ominous fate awaits Tates Messeret, his bosses and the torturers they have ethnically organized. The names of the torturers who tortured and subjected the prisoners who have been incarcerated in connection with the Ginbot7 movement by even going beyond the call of duty specified by Tates Messeret and subsequently accomplished their duty are the following: Name: Position 1, Yohans, Inspector 2, Tazera Bogale, Inspector 3, Katema, Inspector 4, Sidali, Inspector 5, Tabzilu, Inspector 6, Burhane, Inspector 7, Balit, Inspector 8, Jeber Metanur, Inspector 9, Milujeta, Inspector 10, Asfa Advocate, vice inspector among these torturers. The ones who are notoriously famous for their boundless cruelty are Yohannes, Ketema, Burhanu and Tizera. These torturers are sadist individuals who enjoy the suffering of others and whose enthusiasm to subject others to suffering appropriately qualifies them in the category of the mentally sick patients. Yohannes, Ketema and Burhanu are the torturers who took the 31st defendant Vice Sergeant Yabeltal Burhanu to the AA forest and subjected him to untold suffering described earlier in this report. They are the ones who later hanged the plastic bottle filled with water onto his penis, thereby causing great pain and suffering to him. The investigators or torturers who led the investigation that was carried out on Sergeant Wooten Temesgen were Seed Ali and Mulajeta. With the exception of Inspector Jeber Metanor, about whom we could not find many incriminating evidences in regard to acts of cruelty that may have been perpetrated by him, the other 9 inspectors are individuals who used to enjoy seeing the suffering, tears and blood of the prisoners they subjected to torture when each time 5 of these inspectors were carrying out the tortures on these prisoners. These